Alrighty, hopefully I don't cut my head off this time, because I've noticed I cut my head off sometimes in videos. Alright, so we're on page 700, beginning of a grave illness. Remember, Marius and Cosette just saw each other now that she's older and a little more beautiful. They just saw each other, and Marius is very interested. The next day at the usual hour, Marius took from his closet his new coat, his new trousers, his new hat, and his new boots. He dressed himself in this panoply, put on his gloves, prodigality, and went to the Luxembourg. On the way he met Courfeyrac and pretended not to see him. Courfeyrac said to his friends, "I have just met Marius's new hat and coat, with Marius in them." Probably he was going to take an examination. He looked completely idiotic. On reaching the Luxembourg, Marius took a turn around the fountain and looked at the swans. Then he stood for a long time contemplating a statue, whose head was black with moss and lacked a hip. Near the pond was a pot-bellied bourgeois of 40, holding a little boy of 5 by the hand, to whom he was saying, "Beware of extremes, my son. Keep an equal distance from despotism and anarchy." Marius listened to this good bourgeois. Then he went another turn around the fountain. Finally he went toward his path, slowly and as if reluctantly. One would have said he was compelled to go, and at the same time prevented from going. He was completely unconscious of all this, and thought he was doing just as he did every day. When he reached the path, he saw Monsieur Leblanc and the young girl at the other end on their bench. He buttoned his coat, stretched it down so there would be no wrinkles, noticed with some satisfaction the shine of his trousers, and marched on the bench. There was something of attack in this march, certainly a desire for conquest. So I say he marched on the bench, as I would say Hannibal marched on Rome. Beyond this, there was nothing that was not unconscious in all his movements, and he had in no way interrupted the customary preoccupations of his mind and work. He was thinking at that moment of the Manuel de Baccalaureate, what was a stupid book, and it must have been compiled by total cretins. To include the assignment of analyzing masterpieces of the human mind, 3 tragedies by Racine, and only 1 of Moliere's comedies. He had a sharp ringing in his ear. While approaching the bench, he smoothed the wrinkles out of his coat, and his eyes were fixed on the young girl. It seemed to him that she had filled the whole far end of the walk with a pale bluish light. As he drew nearer, his pace became slower and slower. Still some way from the bench, long before reaching the end of the walk, he stopped, and he had no idea how it happened, but he turned back. He did not even say to himself that he would not go to the end. The young girl could hardly have seen him so far off, and noticed his fine appearance in his new suit. However, he held himself very straight to look well in case anybody might happen to notice. He reached the opposite end and then turned back, and this time he got a little nearer to the bench. He even came to within about 3 trees of it, but there he felt an indescribable inability to go farther, and he hesitated. Excuse me. He thought he had seen the young girl's face turned toward him. Still he made a great manly effort, conquered his hesitation, and continued his advance. In a few seconds he was walking past the bench, erect and firm, blushing to his ears, without daring to look to the right or the left, and with his hand in his coat like a statesman. At the moment he was passing under the guns of the fortress, he felt a frightful palpitation of the heart. She was wearing, as on the previous day, her damask dress and crape hat. He heard the sound of an ineffable voice, which had to be her voice. She was talking quietly. She was very pretty. He felt it, though he made no effort to see her. However, she could not, he thought, fail to have some esteem and consideration for me, if she knew that I was the real author of the dissertation on Marcos Obregon de la Ronda, which Monsieur Francois de Chateauneuf has put as his own at the beginning of his edition of Gil Blas. He passed the bench, went to the end of the walk, which was quite near, then turned, and passed by the beautiful girl again. This time he was very pale. In fact, everything he was experiencing was very disagreeable. He walked away from the bench and from the young girl, and although his back was turned, he imagined that she was looking at him, and that made him stumble. He made no effort to approach the seat again. He stopped midway in the path and sat down there, a thing he never did, casting many sidelong glances and reflecting in the most indistinct depths of his mind that after all it must be difficult for persons whose white hat and black dress he admired to be absolutely insensible to his glossy trousers and new coat. After a quarter of an hour he rose, as if to go back to walking toward the bench encircled by a halo. However, he stood silent and motionless. For the first time in 15 months he said to himself, the gentleman who sat there every day with his daughter had undoubtedly noticed him, and probably thought his persistence very strange. For the first time also, he felt a certain irreverence in designating this unknown man, even in the silence of his thought, by the nickname of Monsieur Leblanc. He stayed this way for some minutes with his head down, tracing designs on the ground with a little stick he had in his hand. Then he abruptly turned away from the bench, away from Monsieur Leblanc and his daughter, and went home. That day he forgot to go out to dinner. At 8 o'clock in the evening he realized, and since it was too late to go down to the Rue Saint-Jacques, he said, "Oh well," and he ate a piece of bread. He did not go to bed until he had carefully brushed and folded his coat. Okay, the next paragraph, the next chapter is also good, so we'll read the next chapter. The next day, Mame Beaujean, that is how Courfeyrac referred to the old concierge lady of the Gorbeau tenement. Madame Beaujean, her name was really Madame Bourgeon, but as we have stated, but the terrible Courfeyrac respected nothing. Mame Beaujean was astonished to see Marius go out again in his new suit. He went back to the Luxembourg, but did not get beyond his bench midway down the path. He sat there as the previous day, gazing from a distance, and distinctly seeing the white hat, the black dress, and particularly the bluish light. He did not stir from the seat, and did not go home until the gates of Luxembourg were shut. He did not see Monsieur Leblanc and his daughter leave the park. He concluded from that they had left the garden by the gate on the Rue de l'Ost. Afterwards, some weeks later, when he thought of it, he could not remember where he had dined that night. The next day, for the third time, Madame Beaujean was thunderstruck. Marius went out in his new suit. 3 days running, she exclaimed. She tried to follow him, but Marius walked briskly and with immense strides. It was a hippopotamus attempting to catch a chamois. In 2 minutes she lost sight of him and came back out of breath, 3/4 choked by her asthma and furious. "Silly," she grumbled, "putting on his handsome clothes every day, making people run like that." Marius had gone to the Luxembourg. The young girl was there with Monsieur Leblanc. Marius went as near as he could, pretending to read a book, but he was still far off, then turned back and sat down on his bench, where he spent hours watching the artless little sparrows as they hopped along the walk. They seemed to be mocking him. 2 weeks rolled by this way. Marius went to the Luxembourg, no longer to walk back and forth, but to sit down, always in the same place, and without knowing why. Once there, he did not stir. Every morning he put on his new suit, not to be conspicuous, and he did it again the next morning. She was certainly marvelously beautiful. The only possible remark that would come close to criticism is that the contradiction between her look, which was sad, and her smile, which was joyful, gave her face a slightly wild expression, with the result that at certain moments the sweet face turned a bit strange without ceasing to be charming. Okay, I'll give you guys time to pull quotes. Then we're going to continue with Taken Prisoner 704.